Welcome, everyone, to the 21st Danilo Husar Struk Memorial Lecture. My name is Maxim Tarnowski. It's my privilege to have been the director and to continue as the director of this program now for 22 years. Every year I was very proud of the fact that the number was the same for the count of the lectures and the year since we inaugurated the program. This year, unfortunately, the number matches the century, but we've lost a year because of COVID. Last year, unfortunately, in fact, today's speaker, Dr. Finnin, had agreed, and then as COVID decimated the landscape, there was no longer a possibility to do it in person, and we didn't do it virtually either. This lecture series honors Danilo Husar Struk, who was a professor at the University of Toronto. He taught Ukrainian language and literature in the Slavic department, where he was my mentor. In fact, I probably owe him my position there today. Unfortunately, he died very, very unexpectedly and prematurely, and we established this lecture series to honor his memory. And we, as I said, we've been doing it for 22 years now, and they're on, please go out on our website and have a look at the very long list of speakers in our series. And hopefully we will continue to add prominent names to that list in the future, as we do today as well. Today's speaker, Dr. Rory Finnin, is actually an American. He's from Cleveland, Ohio, but he is the University Senior Lecturer in Ukrainian Studies at the University of Cambridge, in a position that most of us remember how it was founded, and it was a great achievement to have another position in Ukrainian Studies, this one in the UK. He was the founding director of Cambridge Ukrainian Studies, had that position from 2008 to 2018. Today, I understand Olenka Pelna is the director of that program. He's the former head of the Department of Slavonic Studies at Cambridge. He's the former chair of the Cambridge Committee for Russian and East European Studies. He has a long record of achievement, among which I will mention one that I find particularly ennobling. That is, he was a Peace Corps volunteer in his day, a little ways back, but nevertheless, one of those very honorable things that Americans do. Rory Finnin received his PhD in Slavic languages and comparative literature from Columbia University in 2010. His dissertation title, Distant Voices, Allusions to the Crimean Tatar Deportations in Three Literatures of the Black Sea. The three literatures, I will point out, are Russian, Turkish, and Ukrainian, right? And as we can see from that, it's a comparative study of literary allusions to deportation, displacement of the Crimean Tatars. And it's obviously a topic not too far from what Dr. Finnin will be speaking to us about today. He is the author of a forthcoming book, once again in this same area. That is, the title is Blood of Others, Stalin's Crimea Atrocity and the Poetics of Solidarity. That volume will be forthcoming from the University of Toronto Press. I'm not sure if there's a date scheduled for it yet, but we're all looking forward to it as soon as possible. He is also the co-author with Alexander Etkin, William Blacker, and Julie Fedor, Simon Lewis, Maria Malcoso, and Maltita Moroz, Palki Press, Remembering Katyn. He is also the author of a number of articles. I won't read you all their titles, but I will say that I was particularly struck with Dr. Finnin early in his career with his essay on Taras Shevchenko's Caucase. I think that was probably my introduction to an upcoming scholar in Ukrainian studies, and I was much impressed back then. I don't want to take too long to introduce Dr. Finnin. He has a long list of accomplishments that I could read here and waste your time, but I think we'd all rather hear him speak. So I will turn over the floor to Rory for a lecture entitled VUFKU and Vyshnia, Exploring Cultural Synergies in the 1920s. Dr. Finnin.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Tarnowski, for such a kind introduction. I particularly appreciate the shout out to my hometown of Cleveland, Ohio, and to the U.S. Peace Corps. I'm a very proud returned Peace Corps volunteer, served in the village of Chapayivka in central Ukraine. So if anybody from Chapayivka is here, I'd be particularly thrilled. I'd like to, of course, thank all of the team at the Danilo Husar Struk program in Ukrainian literature, to our colleagues in the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and to all of you for being here, wherever here is these days. I suppose we're probably all together in some sort of Zoom data center or server farm somewhere on a continent. But most of all, I hope all of you, all of your families are keeping safe and well. I'm really grateful for the invitation, and I feel very privileged to participate in this important lecture series, one that, as Professor Tarnowski mentioned, honors and remembers Danilo Husar Struk, a pioneer in Ukrainian studies, someone who, with singular industry, advanced and promoted the field around the world, and particularly in North America, not only through his leadership in the Encyclopedia of Ukraine project, not only in a very important monograph on Vasil Stefanik, not only through his own poetry, but also through an array of publications in English and in Ukrainian that crisscross a lot of schools of thought, a lot of thinkers and periods in 20th century culture. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, that there was one decade that held a kind of particular fascination for Professor Struk, and that was the 1920s, particularly given his work on Maxim Rilsky, Mykola Khvilovich, and other luminaries of the so-called Rozstrelnie Vidrodzenia, or executed Renaissance. So with this scholarship in mind, what I'd like to do is just bring us back to that pivotal decade, the 1920s, 100 years later, more or less, with a view to three primary aims. The first is to simply recover, in effect, what I find to be two remarkable works of literature and film, one published in, at least at first, in 1924, the other released in 1926. These are works that were effaced, excised, and expunged from Soviet culture after the 1920s. As a result, they tend to be very poorly known today, despite the fact that they were initially met with tremendous enthusiasm, tremendous success upon their initial release and publication. And despite the fact that one of these texts was written by arguably the most popular, most widely read writer of his time, and the other produced by the most agile, the most creative, the most international Soviet film studio. So I'm speaking here of Ostap Vyshnia in the first instance, and of VUFKU in the second, the Всеукраїнське фотокіно управління, or the All-Ukrainian Photo Film Administration. So my second objective is one that I think Professor Struk took very seriously over the course of his career, particularly in his work with students, and that is to show how bringing such works to the fore, by bringing such works to our attention, how this can avail us not only of new insights into Ukrainian culture, of course, but also new inroads in the study of the region more generally, and particularly the Soviet Union. How the field of Ukrainian studies can be a field of disruptive innovation. This is a very hot term in business and tech these days, and I think it applies to our field in particular. I think it is very much the case that engaging in a kind of literary cultural excavation, particularly with respect to Ukrainian culture, can promise a lot of exciting possibilities and opportunities for students. It can serve as a great springboard for us to think outside the box in Slavonic studies, in Soviet studies more broadly, and even to jump out of that box entirely. Now, as we'll see, I want to focus on two works, Vyshnia's feuilleton Tataro Nove Zhytya, or The Life of the Crimean Tatar, and VUFKU's film Alim, which was directed by Rory Finnin in his debut in 1926. Such works invite us to reflect upon cultural synergies not only within the nation, but across nations, inside and outside the Soviet frame, as we'll see. They, I think, invite us to adjust ever so slightly our conventional wisdom about cultural directions of Soviet nationalities policy in this very pivotal decade. More specifically, these works, I think, encourage us to think a bit more expansively about korenizatsiya, or in the Ukrainian case, Ukrainizatsiya, that basket of policies by which national elites, national cultures, national languages were to be rooted in national territories. And I think when we can expand this particular understanding, we'll see something that I often term cross-korenizatsiya, which is a transnational collaboration and interaction of different national cultures that pose a specific threat, I think, to the Soviet regime. Okay, now my third objective finally is to flatten the course of a century, in a sense, to let these two texts speak to our current highly contested, often frankly tragic moment, because they both confront a question as sensitive and as radioactive as ever. Chi Krim, or to whom does Crimea belong? Today, 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, 7 years since Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, the Black Sea Peninsula remains a territory upon which possessive pronouns cling and clamber. The Russian writer and filmmaker Arkady Arkhanov once satirized this condition by proposing a video game called Chi Krim. But since 2014, despite clear international legal consensus, of course, that Crimea is sovereign Ukrainian territory under Russian military and political occupation, some Russians have replied to the question Chi Krim with a defiant meme, Krim nash, Crimea is ours. A slogan whose very existence and circulation, I think, betrays a fundamental anxiety about possession of the so-called fateful peninsula. Just recall this observation from Edward Said. If you belong in a place, you do not need to keep saying and showing it. But colonial appropriation requires such assertive inflections. In other words, to flip a line from Queen Gertrude in Hamlet, promulgators of the Krim nash meme doth attest too much. As we will see, written and produced nearly 100 years ago, Vyshnia's feuilleton Tataro Nove Zhytya and Tassin's film Alim have a great deal of things to say about, one, the Russian colonial possession of Crimea, two, the dispossession of the Crimean Tatars, not only in the Russian imperial period, but indeed in the Soviet Union itself, and three, about the importance of a specifically Ukrainian response to both issues, to both problems. So this is fraught material. So I want to begin at least with some levity and begin with Ostap Vyshnia, the nom de plume of Pavlo Hubenko. And I'm tempted to quote the king in Alice in Wonderland here. Begin at the beginning and go till you come to the end, then stop. Because the funny just so aw shucks feel of Lewis Carroll's formulation here has a really distinctive Vyshnevian flavor. So for him, good laughter, as he once remarked, is not laughter that insults, but laughter that nurtures and uplifts. Those of you who have read Vyshnia's work know what I mean. Those of you who have not yet had the pleasure, particularly undergraduates out there, you'll be excited to know that a selection of his work, first translated by Yuri Tkach in 1981, has been recently republished by Glagoslav Publications with an introduction by our very own Professor Tarnowski. So easily found online, very much worth your time and a great read. Now, Vyshnia had fun with beginnings, even in moments that threatened the end. He was arrested repeatedly by the Bolshevik regime, most infamously in 1933, before being charged with trying to foment uprising and terror. Vostanie I terrora were the words actually used in the text of his indictment. The following is a clip from the film Iz Życia Ostapa Vyshny, from the life of Ostap Vyshnia, whose very title gestures to the hagiographical with that use of życie, in which the late great actor Bogdan Stupka plays Vyshnia being playful, even when answering an NKVD officer who asks in an interrogation, "Z czego vse poczalось?" How did it all begin, or where to start? Note here how Stupka identifies himself, or I should say Stupka as Vyshnia, identifies himself here in hybrid terms. First as an Ukrainsky pismenik, and then as a Sovietsko-Ukrainsky pismenik.
Прізвище, ім'я по батькові. Губенко Павло Михайлович. Український письменник, вибачте, совєтсько-український письменник.
Громадянине Губенко, з чого все почалось?
Раніше на землі не було нічого. І землі теж не було. Пусто було навкруги, ні тобі не вийти нікуди, ні тобі виїхати. Був Бог, сам Господь Саваоф.
Now, the filmmakers here are not citing any interrogation transcript. They're actually repurposing a piece entitled Pochodzenia Svitu, or Origin of the World, Genesis, that Vyshnia had written in 1923 in the journal Znatya. And it was around this time that progressively Vyshnia begins to emerge as Ukraine's Mark Twain, a literary phenomenon whose popularity, it was said, rivaled two others in early Soviet Ukraine, Taras Shevchenko and Vladimir Lenin. His bread and butter, let's say, was a genre of his own creation, funny feuilleton or vignettes that he termed usmishki, or smiles. In the 1920s, they appeared regularly in major newspapers, in particular Visti Vutseveka, which was the official government periodical, the official organ of the party in Ukraine, promoting Ukrainizatsiya. It was published in Kharkiv. Its circulation ran the gamut between 50,000 and 80,000, a circulation that was actually much higher than Pravda in Soviet Ukraine. But these usmishki would be then subsequently released as thematic cycles, which sold so well that Vyshnia became known as the Korol Ukrainskoho Tiraju, the king of the Ukrainian print run, a print run that was said ran into 7 figures. This nickname was not always one used by his friends, by the way, but that's another lecture subject, I think. So why was he so popular? Well, in a Soviet Ukraine increasingly consumed by ideological strictures, beset by internal censorship, Vyshnia's satirical usmishki were a kind of breath of fresh air. They were topical in content, playful and disarming in tone. Here's how Alexander Dovzhenko portrayed him in the mid-1920s. This is before Dovzhenko became the famous filmmaker. At this point, he was a cartoonist known as Sashko. But you see how he renders Vyshnia here. On the left, you have the reader's vision of Vyshnia. Of course, Vyshnia meaning cherry, hence the head. On the right, you have Vyshnia in real life, haggard, overtired, disheveled. But really, nothing escaped Vyshnia's wit. He was incredibly prolific. His humor ranged from subjects that included the rise of Mussolini to the geostrategic utility of canals. These usmishki really delighted in hurdling readers between domestic and international topics with abandon. And very much like the simple-minded, lighthearted Ukrainian peasant narrators of Hryhory Kvitko-Snovyanenko, Nikolai Gogol, Vyshnia's persona had a forked tongue and spoke at times in the Ukrainian-Russian non-standard linguistic hybrid known as Surjik. Again, this was a point raised not only by his friends, some of his counterparts in Ukrainian culture at this time critiqued him for this prosta mova, for speaking the language of the peasantry and the proletariat in this way. But in general, no matter what he said, no matter how he spoke, there was always something subversive behind his seemingly innocent explorations of the status quo. So a cagey wink in the wide eyes, let's say. The maverick prose stylist, troublemaker, polemicist Mykola Khrylovey, Vyshnia's close friend, very much a defender of his as well, celebrated this multi-voicedness of the usmishki. He did so in the journal Prolet Front. Quote, I fell in love with them for their piquancy, for their delicacy, for their rudeness, for their humor, for their profound tragedy, Khrylovey wrote. Now note the attention to the tragic here. This is something we don't often associate with Vyshnia, but is very important we do, because it's a feeling evoked in an usmishka of 1924 that was, again, later scrubbed from Soviet discourse, subject to what I often call discursive cleansing. And the text is entitled Tatarinovo Zhytya, again, the life of the Crimean Tatar, and it appeared here in the Sunday, June 29th edition of the weekly Literatura, Nauka, Mistectvo supplement to the newspaper Vesti VUFKU, again, the Central Party organ, the newspaper that spread and promoted Korenizatsiya. Later, after its publication here in the supplement, it was included in a collection, very popular one, entitled Vishnevy Usmishki Krymsky, so Vyshnia's Crimean smiles. But again, Usmishki have a specific a meaning here. They were published in 1925 as a collection. So here is this initial text, initial release of the text. And right away, Vyshnia points out that it is unusual, that it is singular. He introduces at the outset through a poignant oxymoron that this is a sumna ushmiska, a sad smile. Vyshnia was in Crimea in the early summer of 1924. And in other usmishki inspired by the trip, he does what you might expect. So you see him mocking the foibles of plump tourists from Moscow. You see him ridiculing and sending up the rather sedentary, easygoing lifestyle of the writer with characteristic self-deprecation. But his tone changes dramatically when he approaches the subject of the Crimean Tatars, who are an object of his sustained attention in three usmishki in this cycle. In Tatarinovo Zhytya, Vyshnia departs from the world of satire to deliver what is a searing indictment of centuries of Tsarist colonial oppression, of Crimea's indigenous people, and it's more than that. He subtly condemns a patronizing cultural chauvinism innate to Soviet tourism, a chauvinism that effectively enslaves the Crimean Tatars, as he put it, under the pretense of love. Throughout the text, Vyshnia's voice echoes a specific voice we all know and can recognize from the Ukrainian canon, and that is Shevchenko's righteous anger and sarcasm. But this voice also summons something else, Shevchenko's empathy, evoking right at the start an image of a tearful Crimean Tatar elder named Ahmed, who gazes off in the distance at the horizon and says mournfully, Ranish krashche było. It was better before. So what changed everything for Ahmed's people, Vyshnia explains, was an invasion of Crimea from the north, a deadly whirlwind, vichor is a word used here, across the steppes that beat, ravaged, and destroyed his home. Pobili, potroshchili, poruinovali. Vyshnia then exposes, with his biting wit again, the imperial conceit of colonization as a civilizing mission. And he does so in his very familiar, affable way, as it were, approaching the reader with a hand on the shoulder. Sluchajte, люди добрі, як царі, царентятами приєднували старий бурсурманський Крим до християнської цивілізації. When you read his text, you can see these terms, бурсурманський, християнська цивілізація, bracketed off in scare quotes. The punctuation is almost dripping with sarcasm. Listen, my good people, to the ways in which the czars and their spawn united ancient Muslim Crimea with Christian civilization. Sluchajte uważnie. Listen carefully. So, as good readers, we strive to listen, but to what? And here, Vyshnia does something unusual, something very much out of keeping with his typical practice. Namely, his narrator cedes the stage to someone else and almost leaves the stage entirely. That is, Vyshnia translates extended passages almost verbatim from a seminal Russian work of history entitled Ocherki Krima, Sketches of Crimea, first published in 1892 by Yevgeny Markov. Now, he not only repeats and propounds Markov's key claims, but in a conspicuous footnote refers his thousands of readers in VUFKU and potentially millions of readers in his published cycles, cycles like Vishnevy Usmishki Krimsky, to the third edition of Ocherki Krima. Now, Markov's work stood out in Russian travel literature. It stood out in Russian historiography for following Alexander Herzen and others in expressing an admiration for the Crimean Tatars and a sympathy with their plight, particularly after the Crimean War. Vyshnia's use of Markov is itself then an act of recovery because despite a lasting popularity that led to no less than 4 editions between 1872 and 1911, Markov's Ocherki Krima was not reprinted at any point in the Soviet period. Later, much later, after the Second World War, the revisionist work of people like Pavel Nidinsky, which claimed Crimea as ancient Russian territory, that was the work that would later furnish the canonical Soviet narrative of Crimea's history. It's a narrative that we can hear in the corridors of the Kremlin today. It was recycled and dusted off in Vladimir Putin's infamous Crimea speech of 2014, for instance. So Vyshnia's recycling of Markov here, before again, potentially an audience of millions, was a very prescient circumvention of the censor. So what is Vyshnia repackaging here? In effect, Markov's text includes a clear-eyed confession. So addressing his Russian readers, Markov asks, speaking frankly, did we really give the Crimean Tatar a better life? He's speaking here of the project of Russian colonialism on the peninsula. Markov's answer is an emphatic no. With a sarcasm, I think, that clearly impressed Vyshnia, Markov writes, quote, to avail Crimea of the benefits of Christian civilization, we first had to conquer it. Now, what Markov does here is dismantle the myth that the 1786 annexation was an act of the Crimean Tatar Khanate inviting in Russian power. Instead, Markov details acts of violent conquest. So in 1736, for instance, Markov, and here again, this is Vyshnia simply recycling and translating Markov almost to the word in this particular Usmishka. He points out in 1736 how Count Christopher Minich, also known as Burkhard Christoph Grof von Munich, how he, quote, painstakingly, akuratno, cleansed Crimea. So Markov uses чистка. Vyshnia in his translation uses the verb чистити. How Count Minik painstakingly cleansed Crimea to such an extent that Bakhchisarai and other cities in his path became ruins and the steppe a desert, unquote. Others in the Russian imperial military assumed this mantle from Minik, quote, laying waste to cities in the steppe, burning down nearly 1,000 villages. That is, those villages left untouched by Minik because they did not fit his itinerary. In the 19th century, Markov, and again, indirectly Vyshnia now continuing, this so-called embrace of Christian civilization caused innocent people to flee their homeland for refuge in the Oktoprak, or the pure land, the white land of the Ottoman Empire across the Black Sea. So this is what civilization, quote unquote, meant for the Crimean Tatars, as Vyshnia asserts. It is an expulsion of nearly the entire population from their ancestral homeland. Hardly Christian, hardly civilized. Now, Vyshnia's extended quotation of passages from Markov's text makes up something like 70% of the entire Usmishka. It is occasionally broken up with some exclamatory intrusions from his narrator, who says things like, Chuli, slukajte dali, got it, keep listening. But at the end of Tataranova Zhitya, the narrator, we might say, climbs back in the driver's seat to ensure that his readers understand that this history of colonial exploitation, again, Markov is writing initially here in 1872, is no thing of the past. It is alive in the Soviet present. So Vyshnia's narrator explains how Ahmed, that Crimean Tatar elder whose tears of nostalgia opened the Usmishka, points out how Ahmed is manipulated, used, and abused by Soviet tourists who ask him to show them Crimea, but act like he's their guest. Tourists who profess to love him, but pay him little for his trouble. In other words, Vyshnia deftly connects the dots between Russian imperial oppression and Soviet cultural exploitation. In doing so, as we can see in hindsight, clearly marked the text for deletion, for subsequent discursive cleansing. After 1930, Vyshnia's Tataranova Zhitya, which again leverages this main media organ of the party, promoting Korenizatsiya, promoting Ukrainizatsiya, to affirm the indigeneity of the Crimean Tatars, to underscore this bond between Crimean territory and Tatar culture. Doing all these things, the Usmishka was deleted, never to see the light of day in print again in the Soviet Union. After his arrest in 1933, Vyshnia was sentenced to 10 years in the Gulag on absurdly trumped up charges of conspiring to assassinate Pavel Postyshev, whose involvement in overseeing Holodomor led to this sobriquet of his as Kat Ukraine, the butcher of Ukraine. Then the Second World War intervened, and very famously in a desperate move, Vyshnia was released in 1943, very much at Dovzhenko's prompting, to rally a very beleaguered wartime Ukrainian public. So Vyshnia was nearly destroyed by Stalin, but he was dusted off to serve him at a moment of need. After Vyshnia's death in 1956, the Vishneve Usmishki Krymsky collection remained immensely popular. But Tataranova Zhitya was carefully excised from every single subsequent reprinting, and the collection, by my count, was reprinted at least 14 times. In fact, this cleansing of Tataranova Zhitya from literary discourse has been so effective that Vyshnia's feuilleton remains largely unknown in Ukraine today. If you pick up volumes like Vyshnia's Zaboroneni Tvori, you can see on the left, published in Toronto in 1978, and even a more recent volume entitled Vishnevy Usmishki Zaboroneni Tvori, which has been prepared by the Institute of Literature at Kyiv State Taras Shevchenko University. Peruse these volumes and you won't find it, even though they lead with this publishing of banned works of Vyshnia. Okay, now Vyshnia was a man of his era, and his era was obsessed with cinema. And at the height of his fame, he began working as a screenwriter and editor for VUFKU, the Всеукраїнське Фотокіно Управління, which was, and I'm saying this for maybe some undergraduates who haven't yet begun to study this remarkable institution, it was nothing less than one of the most startling successes of early Soviet culture. It punched above its weight to produce, I think, some of the greatest films ever made, from Dovzhenko's Zemlya to Dziga Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera. And in the 1920s, it controlled nearly a third of the film market in the Soviet Union. Its growth was astounding. In 1922, VUFKU had just a handful of workers, but 7 years later, in 1929, it would control over 2,000 venues in Ukraine with something like 600,000 seats, serving millions of viewers every year. It also had a formidable physical infrastructure that built and grew progressively over the decade. VUFKU had a large studio in Odessa, making the city, in the famous words of the writer and filmmaker Yuri Yanovsky, Hollywood na berezі Чорного моря, Hollywood on the shores of the Black Sea. In 1928, not to be outdone, Kyiv got a good new studio, the size, as we're told, of a football field, earning the nickname, in fact, from Mykola Bajan, of the Donbass of culture. VUFKU had a smaller studio in Kharkiv, and it also had access to a studio in sunny Yalta, which is where we find a Crimean Tatar playwright named Ömer İpçi, who was busy sparking the production of one of VUFKU's first blockbuster commercial successes. In fact, an action film, brilliantly done action film, entitled Elim. Now, İpçi was a fascinating figure, someone who virtually single-handedly revived Crimean Tatar drama. And he did so with the winds of Koronizatsiya in Crimea, with Tatarizatsiya at his back. And with the support of the state, he helped develop the Crimean Tatar State Drama Theater. It was called Tat Theater. He developed it into a cultural force. His dramatic works confronted problems of social inequality in Crimean Tatar society, from the plight of the poor to the rights of women. In the early 1990s, he reached into the realm of folklore and breathed new life into the legend of Alim Aydamach, a 19th century Crimean Tatar Robin Hood, or Oleksa Dovbush. Alim, as it was titled, turned out to be one of his most popular plays. And so this story of one man's defense of the downtrodden soon came to grace the silver screen, thanks to VUFKU. So I want to show you just a few advertisements of the film in the journal Kino, which is a tremendous resource for students. In 1925, here you see an advertisement on the 2 or 4 supporting Alim on the bottom right, you'll see. And the second advert from 1926. Now, over the course of this promotion of the film, one that began with its production and to its release, VUFKU promoted Alim as a story torn from the pages of what they said was, quote, the Crimean Tatar struggle for their own national renaissance. Mykola Bajan, the prominent Ukrainian poet, who's also editor of this journal, Kino, teamed up with İpçi to polish and complete the screenplay. In 1926, Bajan placed Alim on the cover of the journal with the famous Crimean Tatar actor Hayari Emirzadeh portraying the protagonist, as you can see here, gazing out from a prison cell window. The director who took the helm of the film was making his debut, Ukrainian director Rory Finnin, who was born 1895 and died in 1956. The film was tremendously well resourced by VUFKU. It included Crimean Tatar scholars and cultural activists like Usein Boldaninsky, who you see here on the right. he was director of the Bakhchisarai Museum of Turco-Tatar Culture. And he joined the production to ensure that its content had cultural authenticity, and to protect against what, in fact, the Russian poet Osip Mandelstam had panned in previous cinematic works as an absurd Orientalist sterilization of the Crimean Tatars. So we might say that Alim was something of an overnight success. After its release in 1926, the film began to play among audiences in France, Germany, as well as across the Soviet Union, of course. Bodaninsky notes in his diaries how rapturous the reception was among Azerbaijani audiences, Kazan Tatar, Volga Tatar audiences, and of course across the Central Asian republics as well. Ukrainian critics who almost to a person celebrated the film always took pride to say one thing repeatedly, and that was that VUFKU had created and VUFKU had established and promoted here a film recognized among Crimean Tatars as their first national film, Svoya Persha Nationalna Kartina. They were proud that VUFKU had produced a national film for the Crimean Tatars. Indeed, if Ipshi's Alim, the play, is a Crimean Tatar work that feeds the success of Ukrainian cinema, because again, this was a blockbuster whose ticket sales were quite something, then Tassin's Alim is a Ukrainian film that in turn fed perceptions of a Tatar Crimea. From its opening minutes, Alim avails viewers of really broad, vibrantly, visually resplendent vistas of a very multicultural 19th century Crimea that has one clear titular nation at the center of everything. Its second scene, which I'll just show you a moment of here, is representative. And here I'd really like to thank, and in fact praise, our outstanding partners at the Dovzhenko Center in Kyiv for restoring this film and for doing so much to promote the history of Ukrainian cinema in cool, creative ways. Now in this scene, in a diverse multicultural open air market, which is bustling, as you'll see, with workers in fezes and imperial functionaries in frock coats, Tassin focuses our attention on the dominant figure of the Crimean Tatar Delyal, who is seen right here on in the center of the frame. The Delyal was a herald through whom all the business and news of the market would move. So Tassin seems to suggest here that Crimean Tatar order is what makes sense of this busy ethnic cultural diversity. But this order, of course, has a dark side. It tolerates an exploitation of the poor and the vulnerable, igniting a rebellion in the wily Alim, who retreats to the forest to hatch plans to upset this status quo. But it's important to note here that Alim is no bandit. In contrast to other presentations, in particular, in contrast to the hero of Vyacheslav Vyskovsky's film of 1916, Alim Krymsky Razboynik, Alim Crimean brigand or bandit. In accordance with Soviet heroization, of course, VUFKU's Alim had to be a social revolutionary. So the villains he targets are not necessarily Tsarist colonizers who linger more or less on the margins of the film, but rather local Crimean Tatar mullahs and mirzas, that is the former nobility, the elites, who are guilty of hypocrisy and greed. So here's just a quick scene of the Delyal and of Alim making his way through this busy market. Notice the presentation here of different ethnic groups all working with each other. But again, the Crimean Tatar influence here keeps the order and makes sense of all the goings on. Now, by every measure, the Crimea of Tassin's Alim is a land possessed by the Crimean Tatars. This is a place where Crimean soil and Tatar culture dwell fully and deeply within each other. And Tassin's eloquent mise en scène makes the point repeatedly. In one scene, Alim and his love, Sarah, who's in fact played by Emirzadeh's wife, Asiye Emirzadeh, the two, as you can see here, stand between two entangled trees and frame a minaret behind them in the distance. In another, the jagged rocks along the beach coast cast in relief the undulating lines of their national dress. So Alim's wide trousers, Sarah's veil. So as with Vyshnia's Tataronova Zhytya, this sustained, very conscious, very deliberate assertion of a bond between Tatar culture and Crimean territory effectively placed a target on Alim's back in the 1930s. The film was banned, pulled from circulation in a memorandum marked not for disclosure in 1937. Most of its copies were destroyed. Thanks to the outstanding work of the Dovzhenko Center in Kyiv, once again, it has been restored and remastered. But it was so thoroughly expunged from Soviet cinematic history that even today, some Western scholars, when they are listing the filmography of Hyori Tasin, they sometimes cite the second film in his filmic corpus, Order na Aresht, Arrest Warrant of 1927. They sometimes cite that as his directorial debut. So Alim is nowhere to be found in these treatments of Soviet cinematic history. Contributors to the film, like Usain Bodaninsky, meanwhile, were arrested under charges of pan-Turkism, counter-revolutionary activity, espionage. In April 1938, Bodaninsky was shot in Simferopol by the NKVD alongside dozens of other members of the Soviet Crimean Tatar intelligentsia. Bodaninsky's compatriot Umar Ipchi, with whom Mykola Bajan worked on the screenplay, he was arrested in 1937, but like Ostap Vyshnia, he avoids execution. He's imprisoned until his death nearly 2 decades later. So the case of Alim is the case of a work of drama supported by policies of Tatarization in Crimea, which made possible a work of film supported by policies of Ukrainization in Ukraine. In other words, like Vyshnia's Tataronova Zhytya, Alim is a work fueled and powered by Ukrainization that serves the agenda of Tatarization by offering a vigorous historical rationale for its very existence. So these two texts are instances of what I sometimes call cross-Koreanization, whereby the promotion of a work of culture in one non-Russian national space directly affirmed and promoted national consciousness and even territorial nationalism in another. And as evidenced in censorial practices in the targeting of elites, Soviet authorities in the 1930s grew concerned about the work of national actors, not only in the advancement of their own distinctive non-Russian national culture, but in the advancement of another's distinctive non-Russian national culture as well. After all, Koreanization was a massive, often confused state undertaking, and its outcomes did not always track along straight lines, which is typically the way we understand it, tends to be the way we study it. While it could involve sometimes disentangling and differentiating national cultures from one another, and we see this quite frequently in the Central Asian context, where regional and tribal affiliations could crisscross through Uzbek and Kazakh national denominations. Koreanization also promoted a very confused, very messy entanglement of national cultures. And this intermingling did not play according to the Soviet rules. That is, it did more than simply lay the ground for the conflation of national cultures that was envisioned as the end game of Soviet policy. Remember how Stalin envisioned this period of Koreanization as one in which national cultures would exhaust themselves completely en route to forming and creating the conditions for the emergence of a meta-national, transnational, non-national Homo Sovieticus. The intermingling as well did not only spark simply cross-cultural understanding. At times, Soviet Koreanization empowered national cultures to reinforce each other in processes of solidarity identification. In other words, it made possible these mutually beneficial projects of transnational solidarity among non-Russian nations in the early Soviet Union. And I think these projects deserve much more study. Instances of cross-kolonizacja, like Tataronowe Życia, like Alim, they remind us that Ukrainian culture has had a long stake in the issue of sovereignty in Crimea, in an answer to the question, Chi Krym? And here I'd like to conclude. Because works by most canonical Ukrainian writers since the Fond du siècle, especially since Mikhailo Kostyubinsky, since Lesya Ukrainka, they make this answer very clear, that Crimea is Tatar. Today, as a cultural and political matter, the Crimea question for Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars is about restoring home, about restoring Ukraine's territorial integrity, as well as the rights of Crimea's indigenous people to exercise political and cultural agency without fear of arbitrary arrests, without fear of disappearances, or what are frequently now called just deportations to prisons. One proposed mechanism for this joint restoration is an amendment to Ukraine's constitution that would recognize the, quote, national territorial autonomy of the Crimean Tatars, and in effect vest Crimean sovereignty in them. It would be a very powerful rebuke to Krim nash chauvinism. A majority of Ukrainians support the idea, but fears of precedent setting of a creeping federalization of Ukraine have prompted politicians in Kyiv to kick the can down the road, as it were, despite repeated promises of actions across different presidential administrations. Recently, the administration of Volodymyr Zelensky claimed that the proposal needed wider debate in Ukrainian society, pulling it back from the constitutional amendment process. One of his spokespeople said, "We're working on it," quote unquote. Now, where politics stalls, culture often forges ahead. And as we've seen, prominent works of literature and film have already enmeshed these Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar requests for home, for ontological security. And they've done so deeply, so thoroughly, as to blur the lines between them. So in this cultural discourse, the national territorial autonomy of the Crimean Tatars is almost a given. As Miroslav Maranovich argues, it is, quote, key to restoring justice on the peninsula, unquote. So this brief glimpse into two prominent texts that cultivate a relationship, a solidary relation, a relation of solidarity between Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars, reveals a very vibrant picture, a portrait of Crimea's Sunni Muslim indigenous people helping in modest ways to shape the national identity of Ukraine, a country that Karl Schlegel calls Europe in miniature. So Ukraine may have lost control of Crimea for the foreseeable future, but I think in one sense, Crimea has not lost control of Ukraine. Thanks, I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Rory, for a stimulating talk, and one that makes us all feel good about the multi-cultural and multinational aspects of Ukrainian identity. I invite members of the audience to pose their questions. That is, please unmute yourself and indicate that you wish to ask a question, and we will give you the floor here on Zoom. And for anyone who happens to be on our Facebook page, if you type something into the chat, I will relay your question here. Are there any questions? Vitaly, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Maxim, and thank you, Rory, for a wonderful lecture. Always a pleasure to hear you speak about your research. I was wondering if you could perhaps comment a bit further on the importance of those two works, both the Vyshnia text and the film, as works that were composed with the mass readership in mind, because this is one of those things that we often struggle with in the field of Ukrainian studies. The argument is that Ukrainian culture, production only reached small audiences, and that the broad masses of readers and viewers, their attention was directed elsewhere. Here, actually, we have a completely different case, because Vyshnia was hugely popular as a writer and remains so, and published in very high circulations. And that was the reason he was, whisked back from the Gulag to help in the war effort. And Alim, too, was really a blockbuster of cinema for broad audiences. It was seen as a work that did reach very broad viewership. So how does this impact and complicate or counteract those prejudices, and how does it make these works more important in the argument you're trying to make?
Vitaly, thank you so much. First of all, it's lovely to see you. I appreciate the question greatly. And I really want to underscore the point you're making here. And I started with this idea that these were two works that were not only effaced, but they were incredibly prominent, widely seen and widely read. And so our failure to study them, to look at them, to analyze them more closely, or even to read them, include them in these various volumes, is something we need to of course, remedy. I think, first of all, with respect to Vyshnia, I think, first of all, he was so prolific. So not only was he so widely read, he wrote oodles and oodles of usmishki. And again, they ran the gamut from, tales and chronicles of hunting, from the everyday lives of peasants in Ukraine. And there is a tendency, I think, to reduce all of this cultural activity, this literary activity, all of these texts. And even in the very volatile literary discussion of his time, where he was very much an object of discussion, caught between, on the one hand, people like Chlilovi and Hart, and then the futurists on the other, who often critiqued Vyshnia for this simple-mindedness, this prosta mova, first of all, even this accusation of hutoryanstvo. He was blamed for not elevating Soviet Ukrainian culture. And I think this particular work is a riposte to that idea. First of all, it's written beautifully in a kind of impressionistic style. Secondly, he's translating from Russian, again, almost verbatim, but it shows a sophistication of outlook that we can trace all the way back to Lesya Ukrainka, for instance. We notice something very similar in her short story Nad Morem, not as widely read, right? In which a holidaymaker on the Black Sea from Moscow strikes up a friendship with the anonymous narrator of the story, and they encounter a Crimean Tatar boy. And this encounter elicits in the narrator, again, a Ukrainian woman, rather begrudgingly spending time with this Russian aristocrat from Moscow. She notices a similar look in the eye of the Crimean Tatar boy in herself, and it is a disconcerting realization. So whereas here, Ukrainka's text is probably not very widely read at all, Vyshnia was reaching thousands with a very similar idea. He wasn't explicit with it. Ukrainian writers rarely are, whether it's Circassians, Kurds, Crimean Tatars, when they're making these associations with Muslim cultures across particularly the 20th century, they're rarely explicit in saying this identification is present. Vyshnia is very much a part of this. So his sophisticated outlook here is very much in keeping with these canonical works that someone like Oleksiy Poltoratsky, who critiqued Vyshnia for this, again, simple-mindedness, he had that very much in common. So first of all, I think to your point about mass popular culture, there are so many texts, even going through these past issues of VUFKU and the supplement that I pointed out that came out on a weekly basis. It just occurs to me how much I have not read of these particular writers, how there was such vibrancy of Ukrainian culture that really showcased a variety of perspectives and outlooks. So for me, I really feel like mass popular culture, on the one hand, in the case of Vyshnia, could be quite sophisticated. In the case of Alim, it's a very accomplished film. As I mentioned, it's an action film. Its pace is terrific. It looks beautiful. And like you said, its ticket sales were again, something to marvel at. So obviously that, again, put a target on their back, so that the more influence they had in this wide cross-section of Ukrainian society, the more dangerous they were. And I think those of us in Ukrainian studies just need to keep that in mind, need to remember how many texts out there were widely consumed in Ukrainian by millions of readers, and they are not in collected volumes. And they reached so many people and inflected these ideas. And to me, it's a hidden history of Ukrainian culture that I hope that we can excavate a bit more.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vitaly.
Thank
I
you.
may.
Marco, go ahead.
Hi, Rory. Nice to see you.
Hi, Marco. Lovely to see you.
About the excavation that you mentioned, of course, I know that a number of people are working on the 1920s right now. Some of them actually are working on the popular culture. Yarina Cymbal is a good example of a person who is digging up all of these stories and so on. Do you know of anyone who is actually working, apart from you, on the Crimean Tatar angle? Because I have to say that I know very little about this angle in Ukrainian culture of the 1920s. Of course, we know about Kotybinsky, about Lesa Ukrainka, about Atan Krymsky, but the 1920s somehow already falls out of vision on this one.
Right.
Is there any more of that kind of literature that you could suggest? Is it any sort of, if one could say, not maybe not so popular, but more sort of highbrow literature that addresses these issues? I would be very grateful if you could tell me.
Well, yes, with pleasure. Our colleague Alexander Krakochvil last year, in fact, released a volume dedicated a journal issue to this question of Crimean Tatar culture in Ukrainian studies. It's very much worth a read, and I can send it off. It's here on my hard drive somewhere. As far as texts, I've been fascinated. You mentioned Krymsky earlier, and I've been fascinated with these stories about Crimean Tatar activists and scholars who worked very much in concert with Ukrainian scholars in Kyiv, who were funded, again, presumably by Ukrainizatsiya, in discovering and coming upon these ancient Crimean Tatar texts that spoke to what I often call this practical past between Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars. That is, a practical past outside the Russian colonial frame, speaking specifically of the alliance between Khmelnytsky and the Crimean Tatars in the 17th century. So there are lots of divan poems, or poems written in this classical Crimean Tatar divan style, that speak to this relationship between Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars in very sophisticated Turco-Tatar language. I see that Viktor Ostapchuk is here, and there are many fine scholars who've really come upon these texts as well. But in the literary sphere, they were celebrated in various lectures all throughout Ukraine in the 1920s and early 1930s. Lecture tours driven by scholars like Osman Akçokrakli, who worked with Bodanensky, who again worked on the film Alim. He popped around to numerous universities, Kharkiv, Moscow, and Kyiv, presenting a text he found that spoke again to this relationship in the 17th century. Krymsky celebrated it as a text that would make Ukrainians wake up and see this vibrant relationship. So in the realm of Tatar poetry, there were certainly works that in the 1920s were getting around, and again stimulated a great deal of interest. But as I was saying to Vitaly earlier, that came, as we all know, because this is a familiar story in the context of Ukrainian culture, the more prominent it was, the more dangerous it could be in the eyes of Soviet authorities. So I hope that answers your question, Marco. The Krakow-Chvil volume is really worth a read. And then these poems from the Crimean Tatar context are quite sophisticated as poetic texts and really did elicit a great deal of interest in Soviet academic institutional culture in Ukraine.
Let me read a question from the chat, unless the person who posed the question wants to ask it out loud. Let me read it from the chat. Are there any differences in view among the largely, as I understand it, ethnic Ukrainian population of the 5 northern rayons of Crimea? That is, are they less amenable to recognizing Tatar claims to Crimea?
Thank you. That's a very important question. I'm presuming the question is about the contemporary moment, yes? The kind of post-2014 context. This is a complicated question because, of course, ethnic Ukrainian population is always difficult to measure with respect to Crimea. And of course, there is this militarization of consciousness that's taking place in Crimean and politics that is extremely concerning when it comes to identity. As you know, Ukrainian language schools, there were something like 7 of them in Crimea prior to 2014. There are none of them left anymore. So how one identifies as ethnic Ukrainian is difficult to measure, but I would say for those ethnic Ukrainians who are explicit and active in the expression of their national identity, that there has been a really vibrant solidarity with the Crimean Tatars. So they worked hand in glove in a variety of translation projects that brought certain Crimean Tatar works of literature into Ukrainian and vice versa. And that community of ethnic Ukrainians has been extremely open to the idea and very positively disposed and supportive of the idea of Crimean Tatar national autonomy, and they have been for quite some time. I mean, this has been on the list of things that the Mejlis, the representative body of the Crimean Tatar people, has asked for a very long time. President Yushchenko more or less ignored it. Yanukovych played with it, used it as political football. So this has been in the picture for quite some time. And yes, this very active Ukrainian ethnic community has been very supportive of the Crimean Tatar claims to the peninsula. And that relationship among Crimean Tatars has been reciprocated to those Ukrainian colleagues as well. So there's a great deal of fellowship, common cultural events, etc., that have been going on for quite some time. Thank you, Lucas, for forwarding that journal, by the way.
Yes, I point out to anyone in the chat, we have a link to the journal that was mentioned. Taras Koznavsky has a question.
I have 2 questions. Thank you. First of all, thank you for a fascinating lecture. And I'm really looking forward to reading your book on Crimean Tatars. Perhaps you could give us sort of a brief overview of your material, the way you see Crimea and Tatars are featured in Ukrainian cultural literary context. I'm thinking, where do you start? Where do you end? Do you start with something like Levko Borovikovsky's translations of Sonety Krymsky? What place Kotyubinsky would have in this investigation? So it's really something which is long overdue, and I'm really happy that it's going to be addressed shortly in your book. That's one question. And the other question is, I don't know how, what context you study Vyshnia's output on Crimea or outside of that particular topic, whether you had a chance to look at his Usmishki from the viewpoint of genre theory, in particular simple forms, like apocryphal legends of Chapek or Zoshchenko, whether we could look at these simple things as, well, we can even look at it as avant-garde approach to literary craft. So whether you had a chance to look at it through this prism.
Thank you very much, Taras. Nice to see you, by the way. I first of all came to Vyshnia, well, in conversations with Vitaly Chernetsky ages ago. But I initially came to Vyshnia through Crimean Tatars who told me about a particular Usmishka, they couldn't recall the title, that dealt with this issue of colonization of the peninsula, the relationship of Ukrainians to Crimean Tatars. And so I spent a lot of time trying to track this particular Usmishka down. So I myself found it extremely fascinating for some of the reasons I mentioned earlier. That is, it seemed to defy the expectation I had about what kind of Usmishka I'd be reading, what kind of humor I would see in this text. So I want to do much more work on him because, again, there's so much he's written. The idea of approaching it by way of genre theory is fascinating. I think Khvailovi, in his defense of Vyshnia again being critiqued in the journal Nova Generacja for, again, this simple-mindedness. For Khvailovi, he absolutely saw Vyshnia's work as avant-garde. So I'd love to pursue that further. As for the book, it's really trying to address a question that I've always found fascinating, and that is, what does literature do in the world? And in the context of the deportation of the Crimean Tatars in 1944, the one thing that one sees reading around Ukrainian literature, Russian literature, Turkish literature, is this abiding interest in the event itself. And when you begin to understand what this interest is about, you see that actually literature was first in addressing and exposing audiences to the event itself, which was shrouded in secrecy. So well before there were open petitions and letters, well before there were entries in Chronika Tekushik Sobeti and other dissident journals and publications in the Samizdat Samvidav underground, it was actually poetry that was alerting readers across this Black Sea space to this egregious event that took the lives of tens of thousands of Crimean Tatars, mostly women and children and the elderly, because a lot of the men were at the front. So I'm very fascinated with the question here of why literature in the first instance. What is literature doing? What does a poem do in activating someone's support of a group that they don't belong to, that is very far afield? The Crimean Tatars were exiled, of course, to Uzbekistan and the Urals and Siberia. So at a kind of general comparative level, I'm interested in what these texts are doing and how they activate a sense of solidarity, a spirit of solidarity. That's the first kind of objective of the book. As far as where to begin in the Ukrainian context, you're absolutely right. It's an open question. I think the farther you go, particularly if you go back to 16th, 17th century Dume, you see the typical stereotype of the raiding black clouds of Crimean Tatars taking to Ukrainian territory, abducting women, etc. And it's fascinating that it's Kotyubinsky and Ukrainka, particularly in the Fondosieko, who completely discard these stereotypes. And you mentioned Kotyubinsky, Taras, and his Pid Minaretame is a fascinating work. I mean, he was always, his talent in decoupling the Ukrainian language and the lives of the characters in his prose was second to none. And he focuses entirely on the lives and community of Crimean Tatars at this time. So I focus there because his Pid Minaretame is a kind of subterranean text in many ways. That is, it has a lot of messages about this tension between narodnitstvo and modernism in Ukrainian culture. That is, he uses this example of Crimean Tatar enlighteners battling these conservative clerics in the ulema as a kind of metaphor for what writers like himself and Olya Kobylyanska and many others were facing when they were critiqued by people like Serhiy Efremov, etc. So I start really with that story because it's really with Kozybinsky and Ukrainka that we see a marked shift to a steady and consistent identification with Crimean Tatars that in the Soviet period carries over not only in Vyshnia and not only in Tassin's film, but in particular in some Vidov culture. So poetry by Ivan Sokulsky, Mykola Rudenko, all of them take pains to write about this deportation, to write about the dispossession, not only just to serve Ukrainian interests. So it's not mercenary in that way. It's very interested in understanding the differences between these two groups. But you can really trace a vein of thought going through this literature that again comes to this point of Crimea is Tatar, and that experience that the Crimean Tatars endure is not like ours, but similar enough that we should be active in supporting them. And I think that is playing out even more now when you have institutions like Krymsky Dim and others in Kyiv and throughout the country who are really stimulating this dynamic interaction between Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar cultures, such that you have a wonderful musical group, I'm sure you all know, Kurbase. They had a terrific kind of pandemic concert amid trees and flower blossoms, and they were singing in Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar. And the singing was seamless. It would just oscillate between the languages. So there's such a dynamic interplay here going on. I think it's one of the most exciting developments, I think, in terms of cultural identity in the region. So with Krakochvil's volume, and hopefully my book will contribute a little bit more to the understanding of this dynamic.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's another question. I'll get to you in a moment. In the chat, if you know, what is the current state of Crimean Tatar scholarship in Turkey? How much cooperation in this regard is there between Ukraine and Turkey?
Thank you for the question. A really great one, because the activity of, well, first of all, let me back up and say, it's believed that there are something like 5 million Crimean Tatar emigres or descendants of Crimean Tatars in today's Turkey. So they're widely seen as a formidable diaspora, and they actually have very well-organized and well-funded array of cultural institutions that routinely bring over, for instance, Mustafa Jamilev, Refat Shubarov, other members of the Mejlis, a variety of politicians associated with the Ukrainian state sometimes accompany them. So they come to Turkey. They're widely seen and spoken with. They are warmly received. So in terms of scholarship, I would say Turkey is perhaps the most prominent, most active place in which scholarship on the Crimean Tatars is taking place. As far as cooperation, they are widely seen, or at least the Crimean Tatars are widely seen as the essential, let's say, diplomatic bridge between Kyiv and Ankara. It was the case that Erdogan would sometimes even go first to Crimea before going to Kyiv to meet with the Crimean Tatars, to sit with them in a state setting with the Crimean Tatar flag and the Turkish flag. For certain members of Ukraine's political class, this was a concerning image. But the Republic of Turkey takes this diaspora quite seriously. They see it has electoral force. And again, as I said, they have a well-funded, rather complex cultural infrastructure too. So as far as scholarship, they are doing a great deal. And the other thing that's happening actually is due to this diplomatic relationship between Crimean Tatars, the Ukrainian state, and Ankara, that there's actually increased interest in Ukraine now in Turkey. Much more interesting work being done, not only on Ukraine as a political animal. This is generally the way that I think Ukraine has been studied in Turkey for a number of decades. Increasingly, we're seeing a great deal of interest in Ukrainian culture. There is a Turkish popular cultural journal called İlhamur, which had Taras Shevchenko's face on the cover, and a number of Turkish poems celebrating his greatness, his impact as a national intellectual as well as a romantic poet. So the Turkish component here is often overlooked. This is a problem of the way we organize our various fields, Slavic studies on the one hand, Middle Eastern studies on the other. If we try to engender more of a Black Sea school or Black Sea studies, kind of work that Viktor Ostapchuk has really, I think, promoted over the course of his career, I think we would be getting closer to this activism and this activity that I can really see building and growing under these current conditions.
Frank, I think, had a question.
Yeah, yes. So I'd like to go back to Vyshnia's text, and I don't know how broadly you have studied how he has used text and how others have used that text, but is this kind of fragment unusual in his writings? Was this something that he did frequently? That is, he wrote a tremendous amount, he went to places, he was looking at guidebooks for all we know, and does he do this frequently? That is, pick them up and put them in the text. And then are there Russian writers who also come to Crimea in this period who do anything similar to what he does? So that's on the one end. The second is the date 1924. Am I correct? Or
yes,
yes. Okay. So the picking up of the relation between Christian colonizer and Muslim colonized.
yes.
So on the one hand, it's a time, I don't know where Vyshnia stands at that point in anti-religious campaigns, and those campaigns varied as to what was the major retrogressive faith. But is there any use how you balance the discussion of Christianity as opposed to Islam as both retrograde faiths, and as opposed to how this is a symbol of colonization? And then I have if there'll be time later, I have a question on the film, which I find extremely interesting. It was what was going on that as today, the very nearness of Crimea in a certain sense gets the Ukrainian film studios interested in it. Is this viewed as unusual? That is, they're crossing the borders into another republic. Later, they're going to get into a lot of trouble in Kuban for wanting Ukrainianization in Kuban. Did anyone at that time view this as an unusual action, or this was just accepted in what was the cultural network of the 1920s?
Thank you, Frank. First of all, as far as I can tell, I find the framing of Tatary Nowe Życia here very unique. Now, one reason is that you don't have Vyshnia necessarily going to foreign lands, as it were, on such trips. So when he goes to Crimea, there's a certain degree at which he's home. He can reflect upon, the humorous inflections of proletarian life in Crimea that resemble his own upbringing. Well, the peasant context in Crimea is similar to his upbringing in Poltavshchina. He makes certain associations with life in Kiev, for instance. So there's a certain degree of being inside and outside that stimulate, let's say, a singularity in the way that Vyshnia treats this particular issue. But I would say on the whole, this use and citation, this extensive quoting, I mean, that alone was quite extraordinary and quite different. He would sometimes cite various works and often do it in a tongue-in-cheek fashion. So he'd sometimes present himself as giving this, let's say, academic presentation of a particular subject, throw in a citation here or there, maybe the occasional footnote, but never anything whereby the 70% of the text of the Usmishka is translating a specific work of a Russian historian or a Russian travel writer. Again, tremendously popular. That was quite extraordinary and quite unique. As for Russian writers at this time in the 1920s, no, I haven't seen that degree of interest in Crimean Tatar culture in the 1920s at this time in Soviet Russia. It kind of reminds me of what happens after 1991. Suddenly there's, in the Soviet period, a great deal of interest, I would say, particularly after the work of Boris Chichibabin in the 1950s, there's a tremendous interest in the plight of the Crimean Tatars that's led by Russian dissidents, Russian Soviet dissidents. But after 1991, because of the changing political fate of Crimea, there's not much of an interest any longer in the case of Crimean Tatars. In the 1920s, at least, I haven't seen anything like this at all. Although the work of Maximilian Voloshin had an afterlife in the 1920s in particular. So I suppose, I mean, he was someone who spoke very much in this vein of Alexander Herzen in defending the pride of the Crimean Tatars after the Crimean War. And I see that there's a question about collaboration here in the context of the Second World War. The Crimean Tatars endured this as well in the 19th century. So Voloshin came to their defense. Also mentions, interestingly, how the cultural treatment of Crimea in Russian literature is very much of tourists again. It's not really engaged in the life of the peninsula. So Voloshin calls attention to this, critiques it, considers it a failing of Russian culture and literary culture. But after him, really until, again, the post-war Soviet period, you don't see as much interest among Soviet Russian writers. So I'm of course very interested in finding them if they're there, and if anyone knows anything, I'd be all ears, as it were. As far as the religious component, you're absolutely right to point to Vyshnia's tendency and practice of sending up religious practice generally. Here, there is very much a focus on Christian civilization because he's citing Markov, who spends an entire chapter of his book, something like 30 pages, to critique the way that Russian imperial forces have colonized in the name of Christianity. So in that regard, you see Vyshnia recycling his messages here. Although with Islam, you can sense, I won't call it an Orientalist reception of Islam, but there's a certain treatment with kid gloves that Vyshnia gives it here. Whereas elsewhere, he's more vociferous in critiquing the practices of Christianity, or really the agents of the institutional church. We don't see much more of it in the Muslim context. But in this particular Usmishka, again, it's not dealt with, and the focus is instead on this hypocrisy of the Christian colonizer. As far as the nearness of Crimea, I agree that there's well, first of all, there's the practical matter of being able to film in Yalta, the natural light that made filming such a pleasure in Crimea, and so this studio in Yalta was really a boon to a lot of projects that VUFKU was interested in pursuing. But what's fascinating to me is the funding coming from Ukrainizatsiya through Kyiv, through VUFKU, and supporting essentially a group within Soviet Russia, technically. So that is a fascinating relationship when it comes to just the financial transaction alone. You have a lot of questions, and I'd love to, you've given me tons of food for thought as usual, Frank. So I'm going to maybe leave it there. I feel like my answer is already long-winded enough.
Thank you. I see Victor has a question.
Yes. Oh, hi, Rory.
Victor.
There's been quite a bit of interest in the Crimean Tatar studies. It's a bit off topic, but I'll just say a few things. First of all, one thing I noticed when I was living in Ukraine and when working with them on Prasak, and we started getting Oriental studies, and particularly Ottoman studies going in Ukraine in the 90s. Well, as you know, Ukraine Oriental studies were decimated, but I mean, the Crimean Tatars situation was even worse. I mean, here, unlike what Stalin said about Ukrainians, they could actually deport them all. And with that, in those years, one thing I noticed was that in general, the intelligentsia was very weak. Very few people, especially involved in scholarship. There was almost nobody. It's gotten better. There are some very prolific and good scholars, for example, Oleg Rustemov, who is in Crimea still now doing his doctorate in St. Petersburg, his work with the Crimean sigils, the court record books, and a few other people. Of course, there's people in Poland and Kazan and so forth. And relationship of the Crimean Tatars with the Kazan Tatars is a bit ambiguous. There's also a lot of support for them also in the Midgard Institute. As far as Turkey goes, yeah, thanks to the Crimean Kadi Asker sigils that survived copies of which survived by almost a miracle in Simferopol, and the originals were held in Leningrad and Petersburg under lock and key. The copies of those have gotten out with my help and Holodonologic's help, and in Turkey, there's become a whole entire cottage industry of working on these social economic and history questions and using these 100 or so volumes of 17th and 18th century court record books, which are extremely rich and difficult sources. And in general, the problem with Ottoman, as far as Ukrainians and Crimea and Turks, Crimean Tatars, there are really very few also Ottomanists able to work with Crimean and Ottoman sources. And on one hand, or maybe a little bit more, I mean, there's Oleg Kuchinsky now, who's working in Istanbul, Oleg Sreda, Alenko, Drega, myself, really very few for that kind of this kind of a field. So there isn't much of a critical mass for cooperation yet. But in Turkey, the problem with Turkish scholarship is doesn't know Ukraine. People usually don't know Russian or Ukrainian, a bit Russocentric. It's changing very gradually, but they certainly know the Ottoman sources and are doing a lot of interesting stuff with that. And so, you know, and the Tatars themselves, I mean, are in a very difficult position, of course, because they're the ones that stayed have to work through the Russian establishment, economic establishment, and that's a very ambiguous situation for them. And so that's
thank you for that. Yeah. I really am glad you've raised some of these sources that are in Ottoman, and thankfully for people like me, translated into modern Turkish, that are documents of the Sublime Porte's relationship with the Khanate in Bakhchisarai. That was a tremendous resource for me. It opened my eyes to a lot of issues of how, of course, the Khanate was perceived by Istanbul, very much an issue that was taken up by Russian historians in the Soviet period, of course, presenting the Khanate as a puppet state, not really having any mind of its own, to again delegitimize this very idea of autonomy of the Crimean Tatars on the territory of the peninsula. So hopefully more of those sources are made available. And again, sadly, I can't read Ottoman, and so I'm very grateful for your work and works of people like Said Ocakli and others who have been so helpful. Maxim, I see this issue of the 1954 gift, by the way.
There are some remaining questions in the chat. To what extent does the real or alleged Crimean Tatar cooperation with Germany in World War II jaundice views of their claims to Crimea? Perhaps it's believed something like 10% of the population did indeed collaborate with Nazi occupiers. This is a number that's consistent across communities that suffered Nazi occupation. This was unfortunately a message propounded through Soviet discourse that still lingers today.
frankly, historically, shouldn't be something that the Crimean Tatars in particular have to contend with at all, but it has been used to disenfranchise them, obviously, since 1944. Keep in mind that there were something like 9 heroes of the Soviet Union who are Crimean Tatar. Very famously, Ahmed Khan Sultan, who in fact was named Hero of the Soviet Union twice. So the issue of their collaboration is really overblown. It shouldn't jaundice the claims, shouldn't disenfranchise their claims to the peninsula. But nonetheless, particularly in Russian and I hate the term pro-Russian discourse or anti-Russian, pro-Ukrainian. I think the pro and antis are overdone, but it's unfortunately used a great deal on the peninsula even today, and had been more or less since Crimean Tatars began to return in the late 1980s. They've had to contend with this message very, very frequently. And yeah, as a historical matter, there's really nothing distinctive about the Crimean Tatars with respect to Nazi collaboration. And I think it's an important point you make in the chat about remembering that cultural diversity of Crimea. And I certainly would not want to efface that or reduce that. So my focus here on Crimean Tatars is not at all at the expense of other groups, although in practical terms, I do center my book on this issue of their plight, but really as a way of looking around to see how other groups related to what happened to them, because for whatever reason, it did elicit a lot of response in literary spheres in Ukraine, Russia, and Turkey.
Bohdan Nebes.
As a former student of Professor Struk, I am really glad to see that this series is running into over 20 years of a series of great lectures. My comment is, I want to go back to this question of popular culture, and Serhiy Trimbach, at one of his publications, raised the point that popular culture in the 1920s replaced especially in cinema, replaced the folk culture that existed prior to that, mainly because of large groups of population, of Ukrainian population, moving from villages to the cities. And instead of having this kind of participatory folk culture, the cinema replaced this kind of need for popular culture. I don't know really whether we can prove this point, but I think that there is something interesting, because what we see is lots of interesting aspects of Ukrainian culture emerge in that popular domain, and VUFKU was mainly interested in, well, first of all, making money. It was a studio run like any other studio. So I think Alim for VUFKU was a good adventure story. First of all, a commitment VUFKU to genre cinema was basically on the level that other cinemas, whether Hollywood or Germans, who were top of the list at the time, genre cinema was the main selling product. And I think the exotic aspect of Alim also probably provided VUFKU with some sort of export possibilities of Alim abroad. And you mentioned, I haven't studied the film, but you mentioned that the film was shown in Western Europe as well. So another aspect of VUFKU was that, for example, in the 1920s, VUFKU invited international directors to work in cinema. There was a Turkish director, there was a Greek director. Their names escape me now, but they were at the time very prominent directors in the respective Greek and Turkish film industries. What I want to kind of ask you is how much you think raising the Tatar question within popular culture accomplished more, in a sense, than if it was kind of put on the level of high culture, if you will.
Yes, thank you for that question, and I very much appreciate your work on VUFKU and cinema. I first of all think this question of folk culture and Serhii Trimbach's view that that cinema at this time replaced folk culture or took the place and position of folk culture is a fascinating issue. I'd love to explore it more. I think actually Vyshnia here is a great example of someone who bridges both of these things. I mean, as I mentioned, he was active, not extensively in VUFKU, really in one or two productions as an editor and screenwriter in 1927 or so. But the way in which, again, he's embodying that traditional kind of folk peasant narrator, but then having these interests in cinema, he I think bridges this this relationship between high culture and folk culture in various ways. This is something, again, that I think Khwilovi was arguing, although he did it in his typically obnoxious, angry way at times. As far as the question of the Tatar content, what really fascinated me was how much discussion there was in the VUFKU context among people like Tassin and Bodaninsky and Bajan about doing this correctly, about representing Tatar culture correctly, not reducing them to figures in an action film. So not orientalizing them and not simply portraying something to purely entertain. They clearly felt like it should have an educative function. Behind this, of course, was exactly what you mentioned earlier. VUFKU wanted to make money, and it was very much the case that in Soviet cinema, there was a great deal of discussion about the Orientalist, reductive, cartoonish presentation of so-called Asiatic peoples in, let's say, the former Russian imperial periphery. So in a sense, you can see it was a commercial tactic to maybe take this culture more seriously. But at the formal level, I think the film really spends a great deal of time, as much as, again, it's extremely accomplished in its pacing, in the motion clarity, really well done. But there is a great deal of focus on presenting the Crimean Tatars at home in the central position of their society. And the way in which Tassin does it, again, repeatedly, shows a great interest, I think, in getting this relationship between the Tatars and their territory right. But I do think this background of a kind of conception that Soviet filmmakers were poorly showing these cultures and these peoples was very much on their mind. But again, yeah, there was a deliberate focus on presenting this exciting, yes, very entertaining, exotic Tatar culture in really vibrant, honest, authentic ways. That question of authenticity was very key to the production of the film.
Okay, if there are any other questions, please make yourself known. If not, then I would like to thank our speaker for a very, very lively presentation that clearly elicited a great deal of interest from our audience. I also want to thank all of the participants for your participation today. I want to particularly thank Oksana Struk and Tatiana. It is very nice to have the family still with us after all these years supporting this project. The Struk program at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies is largely funded through the donations of the family, and we are most grateful for that. And we certainly intend to continue. Watch this space. We will be back next year. Hopefully, we can actually have an in-person physical event next year. But I think the pandemic has probably taught us all that online events are actually very good, and they allow you to do things that aren't otherwise possible. And so I promise that we will continue. We will not skip another year, no matter what the pandemic does. And we will be back with another literary lecture next year in the Struk program. Thank you all very much. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.